Sitting next to me is Dr. Lori Wilkinson, whom I think a number of you met yesterday. Please give her a round of applause because she's one of my favorite people and she's brilliant. So the idea was that, again, as I said at the beginning of this morning, that this is such a searing bit of irony that, you know, I was tasked specifically to make this for this conference as a means of education, awareness, and proliferation in schools and places of work and places of worship. And, you know, before we went to bed, this news came to us of you know, the shooting massacres in New Zealand, which once again, as I said in the morning, like it is good that we condole and be sorrowful, but it also makes us ever more vigilant. So I'm very pleased that ISA has produced this infographic, which I encourage each of you to take with you. We have copies outside in front at the registration table. It would be nice to receive a donation, as these are kind of expensive. They're massive, eh? They're like 3 feet by something. But in any case, I'm a little punch drunk here, sorry. Not drunk, Shahina. I'm like drunk from tiredness. Drunk with power. So Shahina came to me with the idea of creating some basic statistics and information on the rise of Islamophobia, or just Islamophobia in Canada. And in fact, when I was doing research on this, there wasn't much information from a Canadian perspective. In fact, I haven't seen a thorough, comprehensive infographic on the subject yet produced in Canada. So I'm proud to say that ISA is breaking ground here, and I hope that this information is shared nationally as a resource tool and an education piece as well. So we first of all wanted to go through what the definitions of Islamophobia are. And you know, Islamophobia is manifested in various ways. It's technically defined as an irrational fear of Islam or a hatred or extreme dislike of Muslims. But however, the term can also include attacks on Muslims and their faith. I'm sorry I'm reading this, but I do want this to be stated out loud. It's predicated on the misperception that Islam is monolithic and unable to adapt to new realities, that it doesn't share common values with other major faiths. It is a religion inferior to the West. It is archaic, barbaric, and irrational. It's a religion of violence, which supports terrorism, and it is predicated on violent political ideology. As you all know, January 29th marked the second anniversary of the Quebec City mosque shootings, which was one of the largest terrorist acts ever to take place on Canadian soil. It was important, Shahina and I discussed this, to not only mark that within the infographic, but to commemorate the lives of the 6 worshipers who were slain. So we felt it was important to identify them by name and also to include their images as well. According to statistics happily given to me by Lori, there's been a 50% increase in hate crime reports in the month following the Quebec City mosque shooting. So even after that specific incident, it acted to almost inspire an increase by 50%. Like it was almost like a window had opened, which gave license to further acts or encouraging acts of Islamophobia. We thought that was really important to point out as well. And then finally, the infographic includes several examples of Islamophobia and how to identify it. I won't bother reading them all, or any of them actually. I think most of us in the room are quite familiar with them, but we've listed several of them there. I should let you know that the sources that we cite are from Statistics Canada in the main from its 2017 report on hate crimes, which are alarming, and I suggest you Google and read, although it is a nightmarish thing to take to bed with you. But again, I do think it's very important that we stay educated and that we, you know, encourage that our curriculum and education within our schools adopts information like this, that it's inclusive of different voices, but also inclusive of different forms of oppression. And Islamophobia, as this infographic demonstrates, is clearly on the rise, not just here in Canada, but globally. And sadly, New Zealand joins with us today in its own disgusting manifestation of violence. Something that we left off the infographic, not so much because we were trying to hide this information. It just didn't fit with the theme, which was that we wanted to identify what Islamophobia was, and we wanted people to act against it. But Lori pointed out some statistics to me, which have been gleaned from Angus Reid polls, articles from the Star, the Washington Post, etc. And it just generally is a Canadian public opinion on Islam. So I'd like to read off a number of things that might be alarming to you. They certainly were to me. Again, this is in general the Canadian public opinion on Islam as gleaned from those sources. 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam. Fewer than half of Canadians would find it, quote unquote, acceptable for one of their children to marry a Muslim. That's fewer than half. 56% of Canadians believe that Islam suppresses women's rights. More than half of Ontarians feel mainstream Muslim doctrines promote violence. 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can only be trusted a little or not at all. 42% of Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their fault. 47% support banning headscarves, which is actually higher than the US statistic, which is only 30%. I shouldn't say only 30%, but relative to Canada. Canada likes to purport itself as this inclusive mosaic as opposed to a melting pot like the United States, but in fact, more Canadians support the banning of a headscarf than do Americans. 51% support government surveillance of mosques, and that again is a higher statistics relative to 46% in the United States. And then finally, 31% of Canadians approve of American President Donald Trump's restrictions on travelers from Muslim majority countries. So those are the facts as we know them, or has been gathered through these polls and collated by experts in the field. They are disturbing, but it's important that we acknowledge and own our part in all of this as Canadians. Again, a country which likes to portray itself globally as the harbinger of human rights. And Canada does do very many good things, obviously, but I think we need to claim our share of promoting Islamophobia in this country and throughout the world. And so those stats were very alarming. With that happy note, I'd like to pass the mic over to Lori.
Thanks, Krishna. I think those statistics really are another reason why we need this infographic, right? It's not just about the terrible physical things that happen, it's the things that people think. So I'm glad that we could share these statistics, but I'm sad that these statistics speak to a certain frame of mind. If I could get the next slide up. Many of our speakers today talked about anti-Semitism as well, and we need to stop and think about how anti-Semitism has also increased in Canada in the last few years. And so I'm not going to read them all out, but hate crimes that target Jewish people have increased by 24% between 2016 and 2017. With the biggest increases being in Quebec and British Columbia, which is also the two provinces where the biggest increases in hate crimes against Muslims have also happened. And if you look at outside of Canada, it's a trend that's happening outside of Canada too. So Islamophobia is increasing outside of Canada, so is anti-Semitism. So worldwide, attacks against Jewish people are up 4%. I suspect that when we talk about it this time next year, when we have 2018 data, it's probably going to be worse. If you could move the next slide. So a study that was conducted worldwide by Ipsos Reid, I think it involved over 100 countries. And so in each country, the people were posed with this question. So if you were in the United States, can a real American be and then have a list? Yeah. So in Canada, it was posed as, can a real, say, Christian or can a Christian be a real Canadian? And 80% of Canadians said yes. In Canada, they were asked, can an atheist be a real Canadian? And 70% of Canadians said yes. Can a Jewish person be a real Canadian? The answer for Canada was 64%. Can a Buddhist be a real Canadian? 61%. Can a Hindu be a real Canadian? 58%. And can a Muslim be a real Canadian? 56%. That's pretty bad. But in terms of that question worldwide, Canada was the third most positive on all of those measures. So, worldwide, when we think about all the phobias and all of the racism that goes on, we, as a collective human society, have a lot to do to overcome this. If we can move to the next slide. I wanted to kind of end on a more positive note, too, because there are some positive signs. So, the red bar indicates people who disagree, and the green bar indicates people who agree. And it's a series of public opinion polls collected since 1977. And you can see that the attitudes towards immigrants in Canada actually have been increasingly positive since about the mid-1990s. So there's more acceptance of immigrants in Canada than there has been in the past. And I see that as a positive item to hold on to. If you could go on to the next slide. I was thinking about the Quebec City Mosque when I was approached to help with the Islamophobia infographic as well. And I was thinking about Ayman Derbali. He survived the shooting. He's a father of 3 kids. He's an uncle. He had a full-time job. And he was shot in the Quebec City Islamic Cultural Center on January 29th. This is a man who spent 2 months in a coma, and when he woke up from the coma, he had 4 heart attacks. I think he got out of the hospital in August. And so when he was well enough to be interviewed, his reaction was actually something that we should hold on to, because this is a man who witnessed great violence, whose life has been changed forever, who lost friends and family at that mosque. And his words to Canadians were, we need to work together. We need to volunteer. We need to come together. This is a man who'd just been shot. And if you think about it, that's a very powerful reaction to something that, many of us can only imagine. And for some of us, the immediate reaction would be to hate, to be angry. And so I'd like to hold on to his words. And if we can move on to the next slide, to think about, how can we help other people get involved? That's a big question that my students ask me. And, as a university professor, my number one response is educate people, because that's what I'm good at. But actually, the more I think about it, the more we get to know people who are different from ourselves, the more we get to know that people are the same. And so listening to the speakers today and yesterday, especially when we're talking about religion, it strikes me how similar the words are that we use in our major religions. And I think educating people that we are the same, that we all have the same roots, that from my Indigenous colleagues, knowing that we're all related. You're all my relatives. Maybe I don't know you yet, but it's true. And so thinking about it that way, but also trying to get involved when you can and when it's appropriate for you as well. I think challenging the aspects of society that are racist is very hard to do, but we need to do it at every opportunity that we possibly can. And thinking about our political leaders and making them aware that we expect significantly more from them. Prayers and thoughts are nice, they do nothing. And we need to make our political leaders accountable for the things that that they perpetuate or encourage. And there's some other ideas as well, but I think thinking about what we can do to make things better, and I think I have one more slide. Just some anti-racism organizations, either here in Manitoba or online, that are easily accessible. These are just some ideas. These are not all the ideas, but if we can arm ourselves with some of this information and share it, because it's been my experience that about 80% of Canadians actually are willing to help or willing to get engaged. They just don't know how, or they're scared to ask, or they don't know where to start. Sure, there's 20% of people who don't care, and quite frankly don't, wish ill will on everyone. But I think we work with those 80% who want to help, but just don't know where to go. So that's it. I'm passing it over to Krishna.
Just one last thing, because I always have to have the last word, eh? That's not true. One thing, just picking up on what Lori said, is that the National Council of Canadian Muslims, alongside Islamic Social Services Association, has been lobbying federally to establish January 29th as a National Day of Action to combat Islamophobia. Obviously that has met some resistance, but it's also been received favorably by certain politicians. So I think that is something, a measurable thing that we all can do, is that we can lobby our elected officials. We hold them accountable, we put them in office, and we keep them in there. So I think it's important that we stay informed, that we inform our legislators, and that we ask them to commit to January 29th, the day of the Quebec City mosque shooting, as a national day of remembrance, honoring the victims, but more importantly, as a national day of action and education to combat Islamophobia. And then I'd just like to finally say, and I added it on the side there, that when we stop Islamophobia, how do we do that? We speak out, we advocate, we legislate, we educate, we report, and then we network like we're doing. So thank you for listening to us.
And we take a poster and put it up.
Yes, take a poster and put it up in your places of worship, in your schools, in your businesses. I understand some people are interested in buying them in bulk, which would be lovely. And she's going to take the mic from me.
Because two things. Krishna did an infographic about refugees 3 years ago. Honestly, I've put that up outside my office at the university, and that has started so many conversations from people who had no idea. So you think, oh, it's just a poster, nobody's going to look at it. That it's true. The first version on refugees, it went like hotcakes. Couldn't keep it on the. This is a method that works. It's an easy method. The other thing I want to say is, Krishna, you're wonderful. Oh. And you haven't been thanked yet, so I'd like to get the audience to, because this poor man, he's not slept in a week. Like, this man is emailing me at 3:37 a.m. this morning with a media release. Like, so he really deserves another round of applause.